Da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. All right, class, here it is. Here's the video, right? First off, I hope your Thanksgiving week's going great. Hope you're not watching this on the weekend. Hope you're getting it done during the week. But whatever, whenever you're doing it, hope it's going great. This is what we're going to cover in this lecture. And I'm hoping to making it very, very short, very sweet, and you can get on with your week. This was my son's whiteboard back when he was a little bit younger, right? But it works well for our purposes here. Yes, we're going to be discussing the New Deal, or namely Franklin Delano Roosevelt's reaction to the Great Depression and his plan for ending it, which was what he called the New Deal, a new deal for the American people, a new idea, a new hand of cards, right, that perhaps could be a winner this time. And the goal of the New Deal was to end the Great Depression, to get the United States out of the economic turmoil it was in. And if we judge it on that boundary alone, the New Deal falls short. It does not end the Great Depression. It does not make these major changes necessary for the American economy to recover. What does that was basically the production of military and weapons leading into World War II. But that doesn't mean it's not something to discuss, because the New Deal has a profound legacy. As we are still products of the New Deal, it still affects us today. And that's largely what this video is going to be about. I don't want to make this video going over every single New Deal program, 99% of which have disappeared, are no longer around. But instead I want to talk about the main factors of the New Deal, what it was in general, and how it still affects us today. So this is our itinerary. We're going to talk about basically how the New Deal was massive government assistance, a complete removal from laissez-faire, right? How when you have massive government programs, this leads to increased cost and an increased size of the government. And then we're going to get into New Deal practices that FDR established, bank holidays, and let's see. Oh yeah, and programs to help unemployment, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Tennessee Valley Authority. We're going to talk about the NRA briefly. It has nothing to do with guns. It's the National Recovery Administration. We're going to talk about the SEC, nothing to do with college football. That is the Security Exchange Commission, the FDIC, which we've already talked about a little bit in class. And then we're going to spend most of the time on the Social Security Act, and then we're going to look at switch in voting that happens during the New Deal. And then last but not least, we're going to look at how the New Deal changed politics and the presidency overall. So a little bit to discuss, but most of this we're just going to kind of gloss over, right? And I'll be referring back to this just because I like messing around with it. But we'll be referring back to this throughout the class, if I recall. Okay, so first off, in 1932, FDR will be elected president in a landslide. We'll see it in class if I haven't already showed it, depending on which class is watching this. Basically, everything except for a few states in the Northeast, every state went Democratic, went FDR, and that just shows you that America was ready for a change. That starts a trend. And if you were alive in the 30s or 40s, which none of y'all were, but if you were, then you would have had FDR as your president for a very long time. He was elected in 32, re-elected in 36, re-elected in 1940, re-elected in 1944, and will die in 1945. So he was elected 4 times. That, unless there's a change to the amendments, will never happen again, because now we have term limits for presidents. Those were established by Congress in the states shortly after FDR in World War II to prevent a president from being president that long, but not necessarily critical of FDR in as much, but nonetheless term limits were put in place. Herbert Hoover's response to the New Deal, although he did have voluntary programs, but the preceding president, who was elected in 1928 and was not reelected in 32, was Herbert Hoover. His response is best characterized as laissez-faire, right? Let it be. The economy will correct itself. He implements some voluntary programs, but ultimately whether or not that's a sane response, whether or not that's a valid response. And there are certain people still today that say, listen, the government that governs best governs least. The United States government should not be involved in business and economics, right? This is still a central tenet of the Libertarian Party, is this as laissez-faire, right? And it's viable. It's a sound philosophy, but it's not a popular philosophy when you have 25% of the population unemployed. When 1 in 4 people can't get a job and don't know where they're getting their next meal, and the government said, put on your big boy pants because we're not, we're just got to ride this out. Well, if you're not going to be the most popular person, and other things went wrong in Hoover's administration as well. They almost guaranteed he wasn't going to be reelected, right? Sending the tanks in on a group of demonstrators in front of the Capitol known as the Bonus Army. People referring to homeless shelters as Hoovervilles, right? They were flying the Hoover flag, which means they had their pockets out, so you can find they had no money. They were sleeping in Hoover blankets. That's what they called them. That was basically sleeping in newspapers. Hoover wasn't going to be reelected, right? On that, but that didn't mean necessarily that there was going to be such a substantial shift in the next president. But there certainly was when FDR was elected with this New Deal, and what the New Deal promised was massive government assistance, massive amount of government programs, economic reforms, government regulation, etc. And this is how we characterize the New Deal. In a nutshell, during I guess you could say the 7 years that the United States was New Deal oriented, from the 1932 to roughly 39-40, FDR is just going to experiment with tons of programs, right? Tons and tons of programs designed either to curb unemployment, to end bank runs, to make sure the Great Depression doesn't happen again, you name it, right? On that. Most of these will not work, right? And when these things don't appear to work, FDR and Congress would quickly scrap those and make new ones, right? When they showed promise and when they seemed to be working, he would continue to roll with it, right? And sometimes you roll with something so long that it can't be undone. And a big example of that is Social Security, which we'll get to later, right? I'm not saying Social Security should be undone, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying it was never intended to last as long as it did in the structure it was created. But as we know, Social Security is still around today, and that's the big central concern. But if you're going to have all this government involvement, if you're going to have all these government programs, right? If you're going to send people out to the woods to build roads, if you're going to send people into the Tennessee area to build hydroelectric dams, to build bridges, if you're going to offer government assistance and welfare programs, well, then you are going to need you're going to need money, right? And because all these programs have cost associated with them, right? And this is really the central idea behind the New Deal, the debate on it, right? Because there's different perspectives on FDR and the New Deal programs, right? Some people absolutely appreciate and love government involvement, government assistance. Some people say, no, the government needs to stay out of these things, right? But really what the debate lies, most of this debate, is the cost of these programs and who's going to pay for it, right? And I think the same central issue is still with us today on things like healthcare and healthcare reform, right? Whether you're for universal free healthcare or whether you're for, individuals providing their own insurance, right? Healthcare, right? Really the issue is the cost and who is going to cost that money. I mean, it's great to say in the United States we should have free universal healthcare. And if that's what you feel, that's fantastic, that's great, that's a fine idea. Right? Except somebody's got to pay that cost. There's no such thing as free. Somebody's got to pay for the services and provide, and that usually comes out of taxes, right? And some people might pay more in taxes than others. And they say, wait, I have to shoulder the bill for everybody else? Is that fair? Is that unfair? This is what the New Deal, the debate, this is going to be the changing debate of the New Deal that's still with us today, right? Okay. So let's just get into what happened specifically, and we'll come back to that question at the end. So in 1932, FDR was elected. He promised a New Deal. The interesting thing is he had no idea what he was going to do. I mean, he was pretty sure he was going to be elected. He was confident in that. But he didn't have a guaranteed plan, right? And part of this is because FDR said, well, we're going to wait and see. And when he became president, he's going to bring in tons of people, CEOs from businesses. He's going to bring in economics professors and all that. He's going to create like a think tank in the Oval Office and in the White House. They're going to throw back ideas, throw them around, spitball, et cetera, and he's going to come up with plans, and he's going to go to Congress for a lot of these and all that, but he's going to try to run through Congress these plans and try them out. If they work, great. If they don't, okay, scrap it, give me something new on this. But one of the big things, the reason why he was given a little bit of latitude on this, even though he was a whirlwind of activity in his first in office, is because he kind of connected with the American people. He didn't speak necessarily intellectual messages to the American people. His speeches, and he would sit by the radio. He'd give radio addresses, sometimes once a month, sometimes every week. He called them fireside chats, and people would huddle around the radio, right, and listen to him. And he had a very calming effect, like this, we're going to get through this kind of attitude with the Great Depression that a lot of Americans found reassuring. You probably know a good example of this if you've heard his inaugural speech. And I know what you're saying, what the fuck, Mr. Ramey? Who knows an inaugural speech of a president? You probably know a quote in there, and that's what I'm talking about. And feel free to watch it on YouTube if you want a refresher, if you've never heard it. But you've all heard the line, perhaps, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless on terror. You ever thought about those lines? What the fuck does that mean? The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That's like, if you know Star Wars, that's like Yoda speak. Hate leads to anger, right? Anger leads to fear. Fear leads to the dark side. Whatever. I mean, that doesn't mean anything. But it didn't have to mean anything, in a sense, because the message was supposed to be a reassuring message, right? So to the soothing. And you compare that to previous presidents, particularly Hoover's, like, breaking down graphs of economy and all of that, and trying to be the smartest guy in the room. Well, many Americans appreciated this simplicity, right? But when it got into the New Deal and the actual specifics, they weren't simple at all. There were tons of these programs, right? And so just to give a quick overview of some of them, right? Well, as we know, there was these run-on banks. That was still going on. It didn't just happen immediately after the stock market crash. That's going to continue on for several years. As banks got closer and closer to defaulting, and when people were worried about their money in the bank, they would run to and pull the money out. So what did FDR do when he felt that some major banks were going to collapse? He closed the banks. Now that pissed some people off. Imagine, the bank's closed, you can't pull your money. They didn't have automatic ATMs or anything like that, right? So they couldn't pull, but the idea was that, maybe the banks could work through that and continue on, and sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't, right? But new programs established during the New Deal, like the FDIC, are going to alleviate that. We'll talk about more about that in a second. And then other times, programs to fight unemployment. I have a couple examples on the board right here, right? The CCC and the CCC and the TVA. The CCC was this Civilian Conservation Corps. And if you ever go around a state park, go up I-45 to Sam Houston State Park, and take a look around, you'll see some plaques that said, this pavilion was created by the CCC, right, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. And what it did is FDR would take young 19 to 21-year-old men. They had to be single. They couldn't have a family, right? They would take them out to national parks and state parks all across the United States, make them live in army barracks. There they'd be fed 3 square meals. They were basically living in a military fashion, and they just worked on public parks. Now, it's an interesting program. They were getting paid for it, but most of the money wasn't actually going to the young men that were working in the parks. It went to their families back in the big cities. And that's what was highly critical. People were like, wait a second, you're paying their mom for that guy going to work. That doesn't make any sense. Why isn't that person getting the money? But that's not actually what the program was designed to do. Strangely enough, the CCC was designed to help middle-aged men in the cities find work. And that doesn't, maybe that doesn't make sense, but if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. What happens when you take young single men out of the city and out into the woods? Well, when jobs become available, the people left to fill those vacancies are the middle-aged men. Now, why did FDR think it was more important for middle-aged men to have jobs than young single men? Because middle-aged men, people my age, they have families, right? And if they're unemployed, not only are they starving, but is perhaps their wife, or perhaps their children, and such. Young single man starving, well, that's just one. It might not be fair, might be unreasonable, all that, but FDR, that's the way he wanted to go. The TVA, right? So it's called the Tennessee Valley Authority, is going to dramatically change the region of Tennessee, parts of North Carolina, Mississippi and Alabama. I think stretches into North Carolina and Kentucky as well. Very mountainous, hilly region, right, down there. But it was in the 1930s. This was rural. I mean, rural. You had a few cities, so they say Knoxville and Memphis in Tennessee, but for the most part, Tennessee was hick, right? I mean, we're talking moonshine stills out in the hills kind of thing, right? No paved roads, no electricity, no running water. People were still using outhouses in Tennessee in 1930s, and it was very common. But there's a lot of rivers that flow through that region. And so what the Tennessee Valley Authority was for the government to start building hydroelectric dams, running power lines, paving roads and all that, employing people to work on these things. And it completely transforms the region. All of a sudden you have electricity. All of a sudden you have paved roads. All of a sudden you have, sewage systems and things like that. This was a monument. I mean, this was a massive piece of legislation, and it was extraordinarily expensive to do. And you might think, though, that was just to give people jobs and all that, and that was part of it. But the big part about the TVA was to bring in business, to burst the economy through the consumerism, right, to allow businesses to move. I mean, think about it. What business is going to move into Tennessee if there's no electricity, if there's no paved roads? How are they going to get the goods, the resources in? How are they going to get the shipping out? Whatever it might be. The TVA thought to fight that through government programs to build these things. So we say, well, what's the big deal with that? Well, maybe it's not a big deal, but a lot of people were highly critical of the TVA because at the end of the day, who owns those power lines? Who owns those roads? Who owns those utilities, as you were? And the federal government's the one that built it. And the federal government retained ownership. And thinking back to things we talked about in class, what kind of system do we call that? When the government owns the business? Socialism, right? And a lot of the New Deal programs were heavily criticized as borderline socialism and moving towards communism. But there was a growing population in the United States that appreciated that. They thought social reform and socialism was a wanted change in the United States, a far removal from the laissez-faire free market capitalism. But there was still the element, and probably the majority of Americans, it's tough to say, thought this was going a little bit too far into social reform or socialism, and and you still see the debate right there. By the way, the Tennessee Valley Authority is still around today, right? And people in Tennessee, the vast majority of that population, when they write their check every month for their electricity, they write it to the federal government. Well, they write it to the Tennessee Valley Authority, but that's really the federal government, right? Is it still managed and run by the federal government? Okay. Other programs that are a step away, they still affect us today, but are a step away from the laissez-faire mentality of pretty much all we talked about in class, right? We have the NRA. As I said, nothing to do with guns. This is not the National Rifle Association. This is the National Recovery Administration. And what the National Recovery Administration was technically voluntary. It was a collection of businesses, large businesses, that basically made big handbooks, big rules on here's how we're going to run our businesses now. Now, these rules were guidelines created by the federal government. And they were given to these big companies like Sears Roebuck, Ford Motor Company, et cetera, to saying, hey, would you please accept these rules? And sometimes within a force, you better accept these rules. What kind of rules are we talking about here? Well, they were things like a minimum wage, right? You need to pay at least, when you employ somebody, you have to pay them at least this much per hour or per day. And then other things like a maximum hours. If per week, 40 hours. It said the work week will be 40 hours. If somebody works longer than that, you need to pay them more. Got that today, right? Minimum wage, maximum hours. But you might not consider where that came from and why we have that today. Today we have that, and we think about it as like, okay, well, I'm at least going to get this much per hour, and if I work 42 hours, those last 2 hours, maybe I get time and a half or double time, right, as an hourly employee. You might think that's just a way of businesses kind of like, I don't know what you might think it is, but it's some way of businesses kind of controlling what we're going to be and what we're going to do. But no, this makes a lot of sense if you think about the unemployment problem during the New Deal and during the Great Depression, right? Why would you want to cap somebody's hours? Say somebody's working 80 hours a week to feed their family, right, and to pay their bills. Why would you want to cap their hours to 40, make them work half as much? Well, because then what does that company have to do? Somebody was working 80 hours, now they're working 40, well, now they have to hire somebody else. So now you have 2 people working instead of 1. But if you do that, you have to have a minimum wage. I mean, maybe you don't have to, but it becomes really hard not to have a minimum wage. Why? Well, why was that person working 80 hours a week in the first place? Because he needed to work 80 hours, or she needed to work 80 hours to get by. What happens when you drop their hours in half? Well, all of a sudden they're not going to get by, right? So you have to have a minimum wage to say, okay, you can get by at 40 hours a week, right? Otherwise it doesn't make sense. Now, these programs start out voluntary, but over time, once you have these things, they're hard to go back from. And then they become mandated by state law, right? Once you have a minimum wage, and the Depression's over, and you hit the World War II, and then everybody's making a lot of money because of the business boom during that, and then after that, it's hard to go back and say, okay, we're getting rid of that. We're going, we were making $4 or $3 an hour, and we're going to take it down to $1 an hour. And that's difficult to do. And the economy doesn't really demand that anymore. It's also difficult to say, okay, we're going to remove overtime and things like that. And so here's a voluntary program that still affects us today. And once things get established, they're difficult to remove, for sure. Okay. And last couple of small things, New Deal programs, both of which are still around today, right? Let's talk about the SEC, right? Once again, not the Southeastern Conference, but the Security Exchange Commission. Some of y'all might know what the SEC is. It involves the stock market, and basically it regulates the stock market. Now, why would FDR want to create a program that regulates trading practices on the stock market? Why the Great Depression? What's one of the major causes of the Great Depression? The over-speculation or wild speculation and trading going on the stock market up to 1929. Put a government structure in place that oversees, defines what's fair and unfair in those practices, and limits what, or at least, what's the word for it? Anyway, places a regulatory body to make sure that things aren't getting out of control there on the stock market. But that's regulation, right? I mean, once again, laissez-faire, out the door. Now we're going into their regulation. But it has largely, the SEC is a very powerful organization, along with the FCC, the Federal Commerce Commission, which was established under Wilson, right? It's taken down some pretty big companies and some pretty big people. I think, well, maybe Martha Stewart, right? What is she, cook or home? What does she do? Home design, something like that. I don't know. Anyway, she went to prison. Yeah, she was spent a year in prison for insider trading and things like that. But maybe more closer to home, maybe some of y'all have heard of the company Enron, right? I mean, before the Astros Stadium was called Minute Maid, right? It was called Enron Field. Well, why is it not called Enron? Well, because Enron was up to some bullshit, right? They were telling their investors they were making this much money, basically, when in reality they weren't making any money at all, and all the investment was going into the CEO's pockets. That's a very quick and dirty breakdown of what happened with Enron. Well, who took them down? Well, partially the SEC. You can't tell your investors your company's worth this much money when it's not, because if that happens a lot, what happens? You create that bubble that leads to a stock market crash. right? And then finally, one already mentioned in class, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time, but nonetheless, it needs to be noted as a New Deal program, the FDIC, bank insurance, right? That you have. It's going to slide and hold it and slide in front of the camera. Okay, stay. So basically, your bank, if the bank makes some bad loans, the bank makes some poor investments, or the bank is going to go out of business, the FDIC is designed to stop people from running to the bank and grabbing their money. How does it do that? Well, it's insurance basically for banks, saying that if, and it seems like it's for you, but it's actually for the banks. So I'll explain that in a second. But if a bank is going to go out of business, your deposits are guaranteed up to a certain number, up at 250,000, I believe it is today, right? So as long as you have under 250,000 in the bank, right, and the bank goes out of business, the FDIC will write you, the depositor, you, the customer of the bank, a check. So you don't need to flip out if there's a bank run. Banks actually pay into this. They're members of this insurance corporation right there, because it's in their best interest. They don't want a bank run. I'm not saying that not all banks are members of FDIC. I don't know of any that aren't, but apparently they're not. Not all are. I know credit unions have to go through a different one, but they do have one for credit unions. Just throwing it out there. If you're a member of a bank and it doesn't say FDIC, maybe consider changing banks. Maybe not. I'm not. Your bank might be fine, but it's a little bit. It's a little risky. Let's put it there. Okay. And last, give me 1 second. I think I got college football on the TV. I got some show and tell there. But so give me 2 seconds, and I hope there's no like. Oh, you can't see the TV. Ha ha. You can't see it anyways. But there's you can see the helmets now. Da-da-da. What do you think of the paint job in here, by the way? I think the paint's pretty cool. I don't care for the drapes. I didn't do that shit. Right? Sorry there's not like pretty pictures on the wall back there, but it's not really an angle of the room that you really see, but notice how barren it is looking at this video. What is this? Mine's all ratty and run down, right? And I don't want to show you my number, and I certainly don't want to put the number on YouTube. Probably show my name. Social Security card. Now, I'm sure many of y'all have one. Maybe not everybody. But you might think of that just as an identification, but actually Social Security, right, is a New Deal program that is still with us today and is probably the most influential one. What is Social Security, right? If you're employed, there's a chance that you when you get your paycheck, see that you don't get all the money you earn, right? Some of it goes to income tax, and some of it goes to Social Security tax, what they call it now. Back in a long time ago, it used to be called FICA. Who knew what the fuck FICA was? Like, who's this FICA and why did they take my money? It was Social Security, right? I don't pay Social Security, TRS, yeah. But nonetheless, most of y'all pay into Social Security. What is that? Well, that money there is basically government retirement. Right, it is government-sponsored retirement and benefit programs. There's more to a Social Security than that. I'm just saying. I mean, there's unemployment parts into it. There's people with disabilities in Social Security. There's more to it. But by far the biggest part of Social Security is the government-sponsored retirement programs, and they were New Deal programs designed to help end the Great Depression. Well, the Great Depression's over. Why is Social Security still around? And should it be still around? Maybe. I mean, don't take me wrong. I'm not criticizing Social Security. I'm just asking the question. Well, it actually makes sense why Social Security government retirement programs would be New Deal programs, if you think about it, right? Why would FDR want old people to start getting money, right? I mean, this is what we call direct aid. And in fact, Social Security is important because it is the first real direct aid program in U.S. history. What do we mean direct aid? Direct aid is If you meet certain criteria, then the government sends you a check directly, right? If, as long as you can fill out certain boxes and you meet certain criteria, the government says, okay, here's money. Now, there's plenty of these today. There's several, right? I mean, probably hundreds. I don't know all of them, but there's got to be hundreds, if not thousands, right? You have welfare programs, food programs, and et cetera, right? You meet this income bracket, you have kids, and blah, 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 you do this, boom, here's a check. And that's really what Social Security is, right? You basically says, congratulations, you're old, here's fucking money, right? And there you go. Well, why is that a New Deal program, though? Now, this was highly controversial. Well, but think about it. You know, a 70-year-old working a job, right? Why hadn't that 70-year-old person retired? Because they didn't have unemployment. They didn't have a pension programs back then. They didn't have retirement programs, right? And FDR was like, let's get the elderly to retire, and we can bring new people in to curb unemployment. And it makes sense from that, right? But you can't just tell old people to retire, right? You can't just tell them to stop greeting people at Walmart. You know, okay, that was bad. I'm sorry. But you know it's true. But I shouldn't have made that joke. But you know what I mean? You got you got to get the elderly people, because they can't. If they retire, they stop working, they're gonna die, right? So here's government sponsored. You know, the government will send you a check. Retire, we're gonna send you a check so that you can at least live. That was the idea behind it. This was, as I said, the first direct aid program in U.S. history. It's going to be challenged by the Supreme Court, and it is highly controversial. Before I get into what was so controversial in the challenge in the Supreme Court, let's explain something, though. If you start a program like this, good, bad, fair, unfair, once again, everybody's opinion on Social Security is different, right? You cannot end a program like this, because who's paying for the elderly to retire? Well, we are, right? We pay into this program, and the elderly, right, basically get the money that we're paying in. That money coming out of your paycheck, even though it's not direct, it's more complicated like this. The money coming out of your pocket is going straight to, you know, to some old person down the street or in another state or somewhere, right? Because what happens if you try to end a program like that? You're going to be like, wait a second, I paid this much. I paid, like, you know, all this thousands of dollars of my life, and now you're selling me at the end when I'm now can collect it? I'm not getting any? That's going to cause a bit of a fit. Not mentioning we can't end it like immediately, because if you stop Social Security today, people would literally die. Millions of Americans are very dependent on Social Security to make ends meet, to afford their medication, to afford food, to afford the rent, all that, right? It's a huge social program. It also is the most expensive social program the United States is currently running, right? If I heard a report that 25 cents out of every dollar the United States pays is paid into Social Security, on top of what you are paying into Social Security, which leads into, of course, the fear. I mean, what's the fear that we have in our generation? I'm older than y'all, but you know, it's still a fear for us 40-somethings. For you 20-somethings, this should be a very legitimate fear. Is what's going to happen when you're 63 to 65 and you're ready to collect Social Security without some major changes to this program. It might not be around, right? Now, as I said, you can't end a program like this, but that doesn't mean the program can't collapse, right? And so it's going to need some substantial reform. That's for sure, and that's an issue that it hasn't been a huge issue in the past few elections. And I'm surprised. I think we have some bigger fish that seems like down the road we'll just slap some band-aids on it on that one. But in the future, this could be it could be coming up. That's for sure. But as soon as this program was implemented, it was very controversial. People were not used to this in the United States. People were a little bit upset that they thought, why should I spend money for somebody else to live? I need that money, right? And basically they looked at it as a tax. You're taxing me to pay somebody else so they can live and not work. And in fact, this is going to go up to the Supreme Court to see if this was actually legal. And here's the deal. the Supreme Court was going to end Social Security, and everybody and their dog knew it. Everybody and their dog knew the Supreme Court was not going for this Social Security. It was actually a fairly conservative Supreme Court at the time. Maybe remind me in class, I'll show you a picture of the Supreme Court. I think it's a hilarious picture. But there's some old mofos in that court. They weren't about any New Deal programs. Let's just put it that way. They weren't around down to direct aid. And they were going to kill Social Security. And FDR decides to play hardball with the Supreme Court. You might know if you already taken your government class. Well, of course, we probably should know that the president is who appoints the president appoints Supreme Court justices, right? According to the Constitution. What's not so well known about Supreme Court justices, nowhere in our Constitution, nowhere, does it say how many Supreme Court justices we will have, right? It's not in there. It's all based on precedent and some laws that can easily be changed, right? The first Judicial Act had 3 Supreme Courts, right? And at times we've had 3 justices. At times we had 7, right? We've had 6 before, right? We've had 5. And for the last, 4 decades minus vacancies, we kind of stuck at 9. 9 is kind of our magic number for the Supreme Court, which is a good number. Because, first, that's odd. You want an odd number of Supreme Court justices, so there's always a clear majority. And also, 9 is enough of an opinion where it's not like one person is going to decide everything on that. If you have too few, then you're not going to have enough discussion. And 9 seems to be the number set at, but there's not set in stone, as it were, according to the Constitution. And what FDR says, I can appoint Supreme Court justices? There's no law limiting how many Supreme Court justices I can appoint, and the Supreme Court is going to kill my little baby Social Security that I love so much. And so FDR threatens to pack the Supreme Court. One of his threats was 27 new justices that he was going to appoint. All of them New Deal supporters. All of them, would just do basically, not a yes man, but, close enough. They would support his programs. And the fear of this, the Supreme Court is going to back down on this, and they will pass Social Security by the narrowest margins of 5-4, and Social Security is with us today because of this. But here's the point about that. FDR kind of played hardball right there. And he played hardball and he got Social Security through the Supreme Court. But he made a lot of enemies doing that. Because a lot of people were going to be taken aback by FDR's position as president. It's the last thing on my list that I have right here about executive legislation. It might be the most confusing on this. But I'm going to tackle that one now because it kind of flows with what I'm saying here. One of the big criticisms of FDR on the New Deal, and one of the big changes that's still true today, is the huge increase in the powers of the presidency. Now, if you actually look at the Constitution, if you remember back in 1301, your professor probably talked to you about, the separate branches of government and why we have that. The whole reason we have a separate executive and a separate legislative and a separate judicial is so one branch does not become too powerful, doesn't dominate everything. I want you to think about the New Deal and everything I just told you about. You have the president, FDR, who's the executive, who's supposed to enforce the law. And yet, all these laws and acts and these administrations and these bureaucracies that are being created, those are technically acts of Congress. And yet, who do we give all the credit? And who do we say, whose programs are these really? Well, FDR's. See, powerful presidents can get their legislation, their ideas, run through Congress. And yet, technically speaking, that's not a power of the president. That's a president, a member of the executive, legislating laws or writing laws. It's not really in the presidential power. That's not really what presidents are supposed to do according to our Constitution. Now, powerful presidents have done that before, FDR, and presidents do that since. I mean, a great case of this is, let's take President Obama, right? The Affordable Care Act, right? We just call Obamacare. technically speaking, the Affordable Care Act was a congressional act. And it was completely different than what Obama first presented. And yet, who do we still call it Obamacare? Right? Because it was Obama's idea, in a sense, not really Obama's idea. You know what I'm saying, right? Because that's the president that was kind of pushing this legislation. And we tend to approve of that today. Like, I don't think the American people have a problem necessarily. You might have a problem with the laws if you don't like the president. But you ask average American people, I don't think anybody's saying that the president shouldn't be able to, force legislation they believe is beneficial, particularly if you agree with the president on that. But by a clear-cut look at the Constitution, it's not a power of the president. And FDR went far beyond this, as we said, playing hardball with the Supreme Court. Now it seems like the president is also acting as the judicial branch by threatening to pack the Supreme Court with 27 judges that agree with him. In which case, now you've taken somebody and made him kind of like a dictator. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not calling FDR a dictator. He certainly wasn't. But he was extraordinarily powerful. He was going to serve 4 terms, right? And all through the bulk of World War II. A lot of people are going to be taken aback by the power of this president and, basically his molding of the office there. And it's a tradition that's continued largely since, right? However, there were some critics. Overall, FDR, if people did not like the job FDR was doing, guess what? He wouldn't have been elected 4 times. He wouldn't have been re-elected 3 times, right? And in 1936, when FDR ran for re-election, he won in a landslide even bigger than the first time, right? And one of the big factors in the election of 1936, though, is a major change that still affects us today. One of the big factors was in 1936, a group of people, a demographic that up until around the 1930s exclusively voted Republican, to a person almost, right? To a man, and then after 1920, when women could vote, to a person, voted Republican. In 1936, we see a huge shift as the vast majority switched to the Democratic Party. A very surprising shift, because this group is African Americans. Up until the 1930s, African Americans voted Republican. Why? Party of Lincoln, party that freed the slaves. The Democratic Party still in the 1930s, and actually still all the way up to the 1960s and early, and in some cases 70s, right? Was the party of Jim Crow, was the party of the South, the party of Plessy versus Ferguson, if you will, right? The party of segregation. It was Dixie. But why then do African Americans switch from the party of Lincoln, the party of the Reconstruction amendments, to the Democratic Party? Well, it's pretty simple if you take a look at the New Deal. Think about how bad life was during the Great Depression. How hard it was to find a job. How hard it was to find, your next meal. How hard was it to have some support? Anything. Now imagine you're black. For African Americans, it was 10 times as hard because you had a hard enough time getting a job when times were good. Right? Now when times are bad, you're not being hired at all. The thing about New Deal programs is they didn't discriminate. They couldn't. The 14th Amendment's clear on it, right? You couldn't discriminate. Now they could segregate, and they certainly did. In fact, the CCC was segregated up at Sam Houston State Park. That was built by an African American group of the CCC. They could segregate, but they could not discriminate. And so the New Deal gave enormous benefits to African Americans, and African Americans responded in kind at the ballot. As there's a huge shift, particularly in 1936, in a tradition that continued, as in general, African Americans today vote Democratic, right? Which leads me to my last point. We're 45 minutes in. We're almost done, guys. Thanks for bearing with me, right? The last major change of the New Deal that affects us still today, and that is the creation of class-based politics. Up until the New Deal, by and large, right, in general, we're speaking of generalities here, politics were basically regional things, right? Economics always plays a part in elections, but it was never the main focus of elections, right? That is completely different today, right? I mean, economics and the politics of class are a huge factor in current day elections. And just listen to the candidates. Just say, do you think Donald Trump spoke the same way to a group of working class people in his speeches as he did to, you know, a group of billionaires and millionaires? Absolutely not. The message is different, the tone's different, the verbiage is different. Same thing. Clinton, you know, when she was speaking to middle class Americans in speeches and functions, had a different message than when she was speaking to labor unions or when she was speaking to the uber rich and all that. Because the politics of class matter, as people are very focused on their pocketbooks. Now, it might be obvious, it might not, I'm not sure on why this changes during the New Deal. And it goes back to my main point. Okay, if we're going to give massive government assistance, great. Somebody's got to pay for it. And who generally pays for these programs? Or pays the most? Well, the wealthiest. Can't be the poor because the poor don't have anything. And that's usually who's going to benefit. And so the wealthiest have the biggest share in in paying for these programs. Programs that by and large they don't always, I won't say never, but don't always benefit from. So in general, when you see programs like that, it's very general, once again, in generalizations. There's plenty of wealthy Democrats and such, and there's plenty of poor Republicans. Or I should say there's plenty of wealthy liberals and there's plenty of poor conservatives, right? But in general, right, the wealthy tend to be more conservative in their economic policies because otherwise they're going to share the brunt of the social forces of these changes. And in general, the poor seem to be a little more liberal in their ideas of social programs or economic programs because that's the group that benefits the most, which means that the middle class, that's kind of the battleground. And who appeals to the middle class tends to win elections. There's no secret that's kind of how Trump won the election. Middle class rural Americans, right, that came out of nowhere and voted in 2016. I wouldn't say came out of nowhere, but never en bloc en masse, right? And it's a group that Clinton had a very hard time appealing to in many ways, right? And that's what kind of flipped it all on its head. Okay, so there you go, guys. New Deal, massive government assistance, massive programs, increased costs, right? Increased benefits with that, right? Leading to powerful presidents, increased size of government, class-based politics, and for programs that still affect us today that are still going to need to be answered today. You made it through all this. All right, now I'm not guaranteeing this is what's going to be the quiz question, right? You know we have a quiz on this when we come back, but I'm not guaranteeing, but I'm going to look around for an object, and this is, if I do ask this question, let me think. Oh, here we go. Link on horse from Legend of Zelda, right? So, if I ask for what weird shit did I bring out, you can write Link on a horse, Legend of Zelda, or something like that. Don't mind me, it's getting late. Guys, listen, I really hope you have a very happy, safe Thanksgiving. If you're with friends and family, enjoy it. If you're by yourself, enjoy it. Whatever you do, have a great week. Don't forget, you got a little bit of work to do this week. Thanks for bearing with me on this video. But don't forget, maybe get your argumentative essay started. Maybe start reading your monograph. But definitely, enjoy your holiday. You've earned it. Have a great one.